Europe just hasn't thought this through. I liken, I've always said that NATO has been literally is an extension of American national security policy. That's it. NATO has no ability for independent policy formulation and implementation. It is an extension of America. The same thing with the EU. Its economy is driven by dictate coming from the G7, influenced by the G20, which are all dominated by the United States. So in effect, we can say that the United States is Frankenstein and that NATO and the EU are Frankenstein's monsters. Well, the United States, the Frankenstein, was the deep state, something that this unelected bureaucracy that carried forward from administration to administration. It's dead. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been destroyed by Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin once warned of American presidents making promises on campaigns only to come into the Oval Office and have men in black suits show up and read them the reality, and those promises couldn't be met. Those men in black suits don't exist anymore. They've been fired. They're going to be arrested. It's just not there. So Frankenstein is dead. Dr. Frankenstein is finished. So what we have are Frankenstein's monsters who can't survive without Dr. Frankenstein, but they're still alive, stumbling around Europe, pretending that they're relevant. They're not. They're just monsters, and they will be put down. That's the reality of it. I think Donald Trump has made a decision that, and he has said this, again, we go back to his campaign, where he said that the greatest threat to the national security of the United States is the United States. And he further articulated that in the form of this rules-based international order, which he said imposes America on the world in a way the world isn't comfortable with and no longer desires. And if we continue to insist, as the Biden administration did, to double down on forcefully implementing the rules-based international order, then the world will turn against us. So he's changing the way in which the United States interfaces with the rest of the world.
Europe is crumbling. The economic foundation of the continent is cracking under the weight of its own choices. And NATO, a puppet without a master. The very system that once held the Western alliance together is now falling apart, and the world is watching in silence. Scott Ritter paints a chilling picture. Europe is blindly walking toward economic self-destruction, shackled by outdated alliances and misguided strategies. NATO and the EU, once powerful forces, are now leaderless relics of a fading order, staggering without direction, and with Trump poised to reshape America's role, the illusion of Western unity is collapsing. The world is shifting, and Europe is running out of time. Scott Ritter's analysis was bold, provocative, and, as always, controversial. But no matter how much he tries to frame the war in terms of geopolitical maneuvering, one thing remains indisputable. The reality on the ground tells a far grimmer story for Russia, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the Sudzha direction, where the so-called fortress the Russians attempted to establish collapsed like a house of cards. Over the past 48 hours, what was once touted as a formidable Russian push turned into chaos, disarray, and ultimately a humiliating retreat. The scale of destruction, the panic among Russian ranks, and the sheer velocity with which Ukrainian forces dismantled their offensive is nothing short of historic. As the sun rose on the morning of March 10, 2025, the battlefield in Sudzha was unrecognizable. What had started as an aggressive Russian offensive just 2 days prior had turned into a nightmarish rout, with entire units wiped out, Ukrainian forces systematically dismantling Russian strongholds, and panicked Russian troops desperately trying to retreat through corridors now dominated by Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes. The grand offensive, which the Kremlin had hoped would be a defining moment in the war, ended in total disaster. Just 48 hours earlier, the Russian military had launched a full-scale push, storming through multiple villages and claiming swift victories. One by one, settlements such as Mala, Pravda, and Chasaparnivka fell, with Russian troops waving their flags and declaring dominance. Russian state media flooded the airwaves with triumphant reports, heralding this as a turning point in the war. For a moment, it seemed as if Russia had found its momentum, but the illusion of strength was just that, an illusion. What the Russian high command failed to account for was the precarious nature of their advance. The offensive relied on shock tactics and overwhelming force, but behind the initial push, logistics were stretched thin, command structures were disorganized, and Russian units lacked the crucial reinforcements needed to sustain their positions. Ukrainian forces, meanwhile, were far from defeated. They were adapting, repositioning, and preparing for a devastating counterstrike. As the dust settled on the night of March 9th, Ukrainian forces began their response. With a combination of precision strikes, relentless counterattacks, and tactical encirclements, they dismantled Russian advances one by one. Ukrainian artillery and FPV drones hunted down Russian units that had overextended themselves, while special operations forces launched lightning-fast assaults on vulnerable enemy positions. By the morning of March 10th, the so-called Russian fortress in Sudzha was crumbling. Ukrainian forces had regained control of multiple key villages, including Counterattack, and were pushing deep into Russian-controlled zones. Dozens of Russian soldiers, abandoned by their commanders, had no choice but to surrender. Others, desperate to escape, attempted to flee across open fields, only to be cut down by Ukrainian artillery and drone strikes. What happened next was nothing short of a total collapse. Reports flooded in of Russian units abandoning their positions, some retreating so chaotically that they left behind weapons, vehicles, and even their fallen comrades. The once coordinated assault had turned into a chaotic scramble for survival. The Ukrainian forces, recognizing the growing panic, pressed the attack. In one of the most defining moments of the battle, a massive group of over 100 Russian soldiers was spotted moving in a desperate attempt to escape. They had abandoned their defensive positions in key settlements like Bova Agronum and were now trying to reach the central Sudzha region. Ukrainian drones locked onto their movements, and within minutes, artillery fire rained down on them, turning the retreat into a massacre. The Russian military's problems didn't end there. As more and more of their forces attempted to retreat, they realized they were running into an even deadlier trap. Ukrainian forces had established complete control over key roads and evacuation routes. The Russians had effectively trapped themselves in a death zone, unable to escape, and with no viable reinforcements coming to save them. The Ukrainian army capitalized on this. Using precision drone strikes, they targeted supply lines, cutting off food, ammunition, and medical support to Russian units still trapped in the Sudzha area. Reports from the battlefield confirmed that entire Russian battalions had been wiped out, with drone footage showing the utter devastation left behind. The few remaining Russian units that managed to break away from the encirclement attempted to regroup along the banks of the Sudzha River. But Ukrainian forces were already anticipating this. Bridges and river crossings were systematically targeted, leaving Russian troops with no choice but to swim across under heavy fire, a suicidal endeavor that ended in yet another disaster for Moscow's forces. By the evening of March 10th, it was clear. Russia's offensive in Sudzha had failed catastrophically. What was supposed to be a triumphant push into Ukrainian-held territory had turned into a bloodbath. The Russian military had not only lost thousands of soldiers in the battle, but it also suffered a massive psychological defeat. Ukrainian forces now had the upper hand, and they were pressing forward, using the momentum to reclaim even more territory. Russian media, which had spent the previous days celebrating early victories, was now silent. The Kremlin, caught off guard by the scale of the defeat, scrambled to control the narrative. Some Russian sources attempted to downplay the losses, while others outright ignored the events of the past 48 hours. But no amount of propaganda could erase the truth. The Sudzha fortress had collapsed, and with it, any illusion that Russia was in control of this war. This battle was more than just a military engagement. It was a defining moment in the war. The sheer speed at which Russian positions fell highlights the fundamental weaknesses within their forces: poor leadership, disorganized command structures, and an inability to adapt to Ukraine's increasingly sophisticated tactics. For Ukraine, this victory sends a clear message: the tide of war is shifting. Despite Russia's numerical advantage, superior strategy and precision weaponry continue to make the difference. The question now is whether Ukraine can capitalize on this success and push deeper into Russian-held territory. As the dust settles on the battlefield of Sudzha, one thing is certain: what was once thought to be an unbreakable Russian offensive turned into one of their most humiliating defeats. The so-called fortress didn't just fall, it collapsed like a house of cards, and the echoes of this disaster will haunt the Kremlin for a long time to come. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth updates on the war. Your engagement helps spread the truth about what's happening on the ground. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Ukraine can turn this situation around, or is Russia gaining the upper hand? Stay tuned for more critical updates, and as always, thank you for watching.